I wasn't sure if we want to start with things that are on the agenda for today or things that are on the agenda for future.
I will say the future ones were there before all the other ones. So in fairness, maybe those should go first unless we think there's better ordering.
Okay. Do we know who owns this topic?
Yeah, Ben put that on there, I think.
It looks like Ben's not with us yet. Do you know if he's joining today?
He's probably traveling.
Should we try to work through this without him or wait for him to?
Yeah, advocate? I don't think we necessarily need him here unless we say we're not going to do it, and then we may want to give him a chance to convince us to agree with him. But
okay,
I can give some context behind this because I've talked with him before. Basically, his concern is, some relatively new to the project. He's been around for quite a while, but and there's all sorts of things like, oh, we do this because we agreed to do this. And it's like, well, what were you? Why though? Like there's important context here on why, and it's not in a place that's findable. I mean, maybe for some of the things, if you know the keyword to search for, you can scroll back to like 150 pages on the TOC doc. But even things that I wrote, I can almost never find. Often we don't write good things, or it's just shorthands and notes and things like that. Sometimes there's design docs, but it's not always clear if they were approved, if they were implemented, what the current state is. So there's just a general lack of understanding of decisions in the project, I think. So I think the general intent was, how do we solve this? I didn't actually read through all of this, so I can't explain the details so much beyond the motivation.
You were not kidding about 150 pages. It's telling me 182. Might be time for us to start a new one, maybe on like January 1st, just so that we don't crash Google Docs.
Yeah, it freezes every time I open it, so I'm in favor of that.
Well, I'd say I don't know the details of all of his recommendation, but I do like the idea that we get a little bit more disciplined around providing documentation for decisions. Particularly as I'm ramping up on ztunnel and WDS for multi-cluster, I'm finding a lot of things that don't necessarily have a design doc explaining the rationale, or we used to have a good deal more discipline around those sorts of things. So it's made it a little bit of a challenge to ramp up, although the code is very clearly written, which is very helpful. So yeah, I think improving our documentation on the decision-making process, as well as the documentation of what's been built and done, is a good idea. Louis, did you have any thoughts on this?
My thoughts are I'm driving and I can't read anything.
Okay. No worries.
But,
yeah, I mean, in general, I'm in favor of doing something. We'll need to work out exactly what we want to do so that we're consistent and aren't just writing things that no one else can find. The one big issue, though, I see is that TOC doesn't actually make that many decisions in the grand scheme of things. It's usually like people on the project do, but it's not like we as a TOC group decide so many different things. We decide some things, certainly, but I do wonder if this maybe needs to be a bit more broad to just, I mean, the architectural decision records or whatever is pretty common in some places. Maybe we want to adopt something like that. I don't know. We want to make it somewhat lightweight, but
yeah. I do think we've gotten better in recent months. I remember we talked about, like both in this meeting and in the Wednesday meetings, using the decision keyword and kind of documenting things. And I've noticed, at least in my experience, that's helped. I'd be interested in hearing Ben's thoughts on how that's gone.
Yes, that's been good as well, although it's not curated anywhere. I suspect for Ben, it's probably not helped because he was there for those decisions, and the more important thing is the past ones. But which is also a hard part about this, right? Is that it's really only needed for people with bad memory or for newer contributors. So, okay, it sounds like we're getting consensus that we want to do something here. We're not entirely sure exactly what, and we should follow up. That sound?
I think that sounds good. Oh, and you can document it with a decision line. I like it.
All right, shall we move on to Jackie's?
Sounds good. Jackie, you want to take us away? Uh-oh. She's going to rejoin here and see if that fixes her mic, I think.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Sorry. Okay, so I was the primary security release manager for the last security release. I guess primarily, I just wanted to bring up some of the more limited access steps, and I agree they should be limited access. I just was curious. In the doc, it did say they were Google specific, and I see John's comments that they're not Google specific. I was just curious who are the people with those permissions, and is that group large enough, or is it distributed across companies enough, namely for copying over like the private builds, and then also running the long running tests, which I think is limited to Sergey, or at least that's all it's documented.
Yeah, I can give some context. So in the past, all of the infrastructure was owned by Google and Google projects that had to follow Google's internal rules and regulations and stuff. So it was basically, I think you could only have Google people in it, or at least we only did. Then it was donated to the CNCF. At that point, we were stripped of all the Google stuff, and we can do whatever we want. At similar time, I left Google. So I gave myself access to everything right before I left. Sergey still has access, as probably a few Googlers do. But we did all this work to get it onto the CNCF, and then the next thing we were going to do was give everyone proper permissions and whatnot. But then I got burnt out from doing all that and never did that. So the current state is really that at least I and probably a few Googlers have admin access, and we had in full intent to let either everyone or at least a liberal subset of the product security group have access as well. Or actually, there's really two sets of permissions. One is the private infrastructure, and the other is the public infrastructure, which is more test and release. Test and release also happens to have a pretty large overlap with product security, which is convenient. So I would love to get more people in on there from a permission standpoint. I would love to get more people doing the things we do with the permissions, like maybe we don't depend on Sergey for the long-running test, for example. That would be fantastic. It could also potentially be accomplished by automation rather than permissions, but again, that's a lot of work. All the infrastructure is managed by Terraform, so I think someone could just go submit some PRs to add the permissions in the right place. I can run it manually once, and then other people can run it potentially in the future once they get added. So I'd love to see improvements there. it's definitely not where it, in the desired state.
Is that Terraform stored in the test info repo, John?
Yeah.
So maybe like long term, it sounds like we need to come up with policies for who should have access to which things and put automation in place. But maybe in the short term, it would make sense. I think we have a quarterly release lead. Maybe it would just make sense to ensure that our whoever the quarterly lead is, they have full access.
Yeah, I'm open to anything really. We also, maybe we don't want to give full access. Maybe we want just the permissions people actually need, like copying files in GCS buckets, cool. Deleting all of our clusters, maybe less cool. Especially given that it's managed through Terraform, right? Like you have already a means to modify things. There's no Terraform way to copy. Well, maybe there is, but there's not a Terraform way we have to copy GCS files around. So I think we could use an overhaul for sure. If in the short term that just means adding a handful of people as admins on projects, no problem. If someone wants to go and do like a full proper thing where we have different groups of people that have access to different things and we line it all up in a very nice minimal fashion, that would be even better. But I don't want to let perfect be the enemy of good, certainly.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. Thanks for the context. I think I would argue in favor of more limited permissions, given it's probably the first time, someone is being either the security release manager or yeah, because I wasn't involved as the secondary or roped in. So if it's your first time running any of these things and maybe someone's not around to tell you how to run them, limited's better, just in case.
Yeah, all things considered, I've once deleted all the Easter releases. Well, actually wasn't the 4 releases, but a similar bucket. So less permission is definitely preferred where possible to avoid mistakes.
Yeah, I deleted a big part of Istio.io on accident my first time administrating stuff. It wasn't great. And it was one of those moments that's like, surely they wouldn't give me permissions if this was bad, right? Turns out.
Okay, well, John, maybe I'll sync with you and figure out what those permissions might be and look more at the test infra for the Terraform and just get a better sense of how that works. But maybe I'll just sync with you afterwards. But that's really all I had. Those are the main frustrations that I encountered, is just making sure there were enough people with those permissions. And I'll update those docs, the security release docs, so it doesn't just say Google folks.
Yeah. Yeah, every time we run the security release, there's always gaps in it because it's so few and far between. So definitely updating it as you go is super helpful so the next person doesn't experience what you did. And that's very much appreciated.
Did I get that folder right, John? It's the test infra GCP?
Yeah.
Okay. If
you go up one layer, there's a nice README though. So.
Oh, well, I'll do that then.
Well, I think it's nice. I wrote it though. Go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, this might be better suited for the product security working group. But I do kind of along the same lines of what Jackie is talking about. I wonder if it makes sense to sort of have a process where we sort of but ask product security working group members to like reattest their membership, that we've got the right people from that company in the group. I bring this up because Envoy did that, and I thought that was, I was like, that's a pretty good idea, just to see, make sure that we just have the right contacts and we have people who are going to be available to be able to do the security releases. And just wanted to see if TOC had if there's been anything like that in the past done, if TOC has an opinion there. Like I said, also happy to bring this up in the product security working group as well.
Yeah, I definitely see the desire, and also even really applies to any working groups. But the product security one tends to, I feel like tends to get more stale because it's not like there's nothing really typically actively done unless it's like a firefighting group, not a proactive group in some ways. So I would be interested in doing something like that. We probably should do something like that for all the working groups as kind of a yearly basis or something, which we have done in the past, but in the past it was triggered by the CNCF graduation primarily as kind of a one-off thing. So we do just need to be careful of, whenever you're telling someone that they're, just be cognizant of the feelings. Some people weren't happy in the past when we've done things like this. So.
Yeah, and I think that's why with starting the product security working group, at least it should be decently non-passionate because it's based on companies, right? So the ask at that point is, hey, are you the right person to represent your company in this group, rather than, like you said, like a more proactive group. But plus one, just sort of doing that sort of thing with working groups and approver permissions and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's fine, and we can probably just do it in the PSWG to start with. All right. Anything else on this one? This Istio security commitment is both slightly vague and maybe slightly a big topic. Did we cover that adequately?
I guess we didn't cover it, but I think it was more so that I think this last security release involved some Istio changes or some more Istio conversations, and I was just I think there wasn't as much engagement as I expected on trying to figure out what the right solution would be there. I mean, we worked together on it, but I think having not worked on a security release before, I think I anticipated the group collectively working on figuring out what that solution might be. But I think that might have been just, I naturally try to get a bunch of consensus rather than just YOLO something. So that might just be on me, but I would say I was surprised that there wasn't more conversation, but I think it might have just been people didn't know, so they didn't say anything. So that might have been just what happened, and it was pretty complicated. It wasn't what I anticipated.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think there was probably a lot of factors that made this one worse in general. Like part of it is also what Keith said, is like making sure that we have people that are actively engaged in the group. Doesn't help to have 15 people or whatever if none of them are engaging on these things. So that seems like a good first step. Yeah, this was also like probably one of the most complex issues as well, which I think scared some people off, scared me off as well, because anytime I need to answer a question, I was like, okay, I need to go do like an hour of understanding what's going on here to give an answer. So yeah, I think what he said is good first step. I'm open to other suggestions, but I don't have anything concrete aside from what we've already discussed, maybe of like having dedicated meetings for things like this when they come up.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm fine with that. Yeah, again, was probably more frustrated when I wrote that than I am now about it. So that sounds like a good plan.
I guess I remember Craig mentioning a security review that we're doing as part of Ambient GA. Does it make sense perhaps to maybe focus some time on upskilling the community on some of the security posture of Istio? We've got 4 security maintainers. I feel like we might have a more responsive product security working group if the general community's understanding of Istio security posture, of how a lot of security things work, threat modeling, etc. If kind of a high tide lifting all boats sort of thing, do we think that makes sense, or not quite at that point yet? I mean, it's no secret that John is one of the most senior maintainers, both breadth and depth of the project. And if like security is an area that, yeah, sometimes is scary there, maybe we need to all take some time to focus on that. I don't know. Do folks have any thoughts on doing something like that?
I wonder, I wonder if it makes sense. Like, I'm trying to think of ways that don't involve, excuse me, that don't involve a great deal of overhead and planning and complicated. We're not good at execution when it comes to complex ideas, or even to like all of the companies that are contributing maintainers need to volunteer to, you know, it's open source. So the companies that don't want to just won't. At the same time, security is priority zero. We have a pretty stellar track record in terms of security and getting vulnerabilities patched in a timely manner before they're being actively exploited or 0 days or anything along those lines. And that, I mean, as far as I know, that track record dates back to about 2019. There's a lot to lose. We have a lot going for us. So I wonder if an easy way to do this would just be effectively give the release lead a big red button to the TOC and other senior maintainers. That's like, hey, if I say things aren't going well with the security release, I need you all to like jump onto a phone call within the next couple of hours and get this thing straightened out and back on track in order to preserve the reputation that we've worked really hard to establish, because we did not, let me tell you, we did not always have this reputation. Some of the early security releases went really, really badly and cost us a lot in the community. I wonder if that's both simple and specific enough for us to, I guess I'll ask Jackie, you were the most recent release lead. Would that have been helpful for you?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'd also talked to John about it. He recommended I should have just spiked a call with Keith and John, or, you know, I could have just, I think realizing a call might have just been helpful rather than, you know, back and forth on Slack. So yeah, I think knowing that that's an option is to say, you know, let me pull in these people. I think that maybe just communicating that as an option would have made it feel better to do. But yes, I think that would have been helpful.
Cool.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I'll leave it to TOC to decide what exactly that mechanism looks like, but I think that makes a ton of sense. And then maybe there's one other idea to throw out there is maybe we say something like in the next, you know, release 1.25, we want to, aggressively either fix these things in the security area or have these areas of the code better documented or cleaned up. I don't know, might be something for TOC to consider, but just throwing that out there, just get more eyes on it. Because I think the one thing we definitely want to avoid is we get to a point over time where TOC doesn't feel comfortable because it's just an area of the code that is atrophied. So more eyes, I think, is going to be better to prevent that from happening.
Ordinarily, in this sentence, I would say that they can book meetings with like trump card authority, but I feel like I need to replace that word in my vocabulary. Override. What? Another word for something whose priority is always top. P0.
P0 makes sense. Yeah.
And then from the TOC, we can pull in others as needed. I think most people on the TOC also tend to be leads at their companies to be able to drag folks along. So that makes sense. Anything else we need to document here? All right. Next up is ingress to service waypoint. John, you want to set the context here?
Yeah, so we had discussed in the ambient working group about adding this mode to support ingress pods to connected waypoints. Right now, they skip them entirely. And this has been a big point of feedback from users that they expect that when they go set up all these policies on their waypoint, all the traffic actually goes through it. So they're quite surprised when they find that ingress doesn't. And what this does is it puts them in a position where they have to take all their policies and they have to put them on the ingress, and they also have to put them on the waypoint, which, to be fair, that is exactly how it works with sidecars today. So it is the status quo for sidecar users, but it's not necessarily the model that a lot of people expect or want. So what this peer does is give an ability to opt in to doing this. Unfortunately, so Zonku put a hard block on this, and I asked him to join TSC. Not terribly surprising, given the time zones. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to join, but I still wanted to bring it up so we could get some discussion around this. Since the concern was not minor things, it was more, we shall not do this, and there's not much you can do. If one person says we should do this, the other says we should not do this, other than escalate it up and see where to go from here. So. Yeah, go ahead, Louis.
So you said that was true for sidecars. That's not quite the case, right? Like L7 authorization policy is the one notable exception to that.
Yes,
Like
yeah,
it's
it's a good call. Yeah.
Right, and people generally don't use L7 authorization policy extremely heavily on ingress, although they do use it. But we lose that part of composition if we don't enable this option. I did put some comments in the GitHub issue, so I assume people are reading through.
Yeah, we've got them on screen right now.
They're on my screen too, but they're about 0.2 millimeters tall.
Well, and we'd prefer you kept your eyes on the road. We want to see you at the
Oh,
next
I'm
TSC
parked.
meeting.
I'm parked now, but I just don't have the screen any bigger than that.
So I think there's, oh, Keith, you've got your hand up. Go for it.
Yeah, I think the alternative that Zhanghu raised was to make the waypoint ingress gateway. I've thought about that too in the past. My big concern there is that it opens up the trust model of the waypoint. Like right now, the waypoint only accepts, from my understanding, only accepts HPhone. And that's a fairly, if that's true, it's a fairly nice property to be able to keep. I remember some of the early discussions around hairpinning was around how do we prevent non-verifiable access, any unauthorized access to the waypoint, where ingress opens that up completely. So I think that's a benefit, even though you do pay double L7 in some cases. One, the user has control whether they do that or not, but it's opt-in. And two, I think it has some nice security properties.
Yeah, one thing also to point out is it's not the same. Like the whole point of this is that you have two tiers, right? Mini tiers is very common in enterprises. So they're not fungible. Like you have many waypoints, but you have one ingress gateway probably, right? You have one IP address at the very least, most likely. And they have different properties that one may not even live in the cluster, right? Like Louis has this big complex 5-tier example. It is not uncommon in large enterprise Easter deployments to do something like this manually, just with multiple tiers of ingress gateways or something. So I think it is a pretty common pattern.
The way I see it, oh, go ahead, Louis.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's actually like multi-tier ingress is probably the dominant pattern, right? Like I don't think I've seen an enterprise with less than 3 tiers of ingress.
That sounds like a KubeCon talk in the making. How many tiers of L7 is enough? So I think of this in terms of requirements. First requirement being policy should not be bypassable. Whether we're talking auth-z policy, obviously is the most important in that category, but also routing policy and things like that. If you set it up for a namespace, you should expect it to impact any traffic that enters that namespace. I think that's what our users would expect. The other dimension I think of it from is that the Istio ingress shouldn't be that special. So if I were to create an Nginx ingress in this cluster, as long as it gets captured by the waypoint, actually, even if it doesn't get captured by the waypoint, it's going to be routed through the namespace level or sorry, as long as it gets captured by a Z tunnel, which it'll be on ingress to the namespace, the traffic would go from Nginx to a Z tunnel to the waypoint to the destination, right?
Yeah, kind of. There's a slight difference though, in that if the waypoint is only bound to a service, then it's only going to capture traffic to a service. If the Nginx decides, oh, I'm going to send a foo, but I'm going to pick the foo IP to do my own load balancing, the Z tunnel say it's going to a specific pod, won't send it to the waypoint. Now, almost every single ingress gateway implementation has a way to send to the service instead, primarily, I think, to support Linkerd, who doesn't have an ingress. So how they tell people to do it is to put their Linkerd on the end of their ingress. So they have a doc here of like 12 different implementations, how you do it. So what you said, yes, just not all the time. Just want to caveat that.
And the other way to bind your waypoint is not to the service, but to the namespace?
You can bind it to a specific pod, although it's typically, you do it like the deployment or namespace level, obviously, but it is technically a pod label. Pod or service are the lowest level of granularity. And you can also bind a policy just to the entire gateway, not just to.
And then it just depends on where the gateway is bound, right?
Yeah,
Whether it's
exactly.
a service gateway or a. Okay. I'm a little bit worried. Zongu's comments about complexity on the L7 to L7 path worry me a little bit. They're a little bit vague. I'd like to dig into the particular things that can go wrong by layering two L7 proxies. Are we talking like double header manipulation, or what do we get in, and what are the symptoms that a user would experience? But at a high level, I think our ingress has to be L7. We need to be able to assign one load balancer IP and then route traffic based on HTTP path. That's a very standard ingress requirement. And we need our policies not to be bypassed. The only other way I see of doing this is if an ingress, an L7 ingress, were to route to a service, if we sort of dynamically attach that service's policies to the ingress. But that seems like it might cause even more problems than double L7 processing. So it doesn't seem like necessarily a simpler solution.
I mean, if, again, users opt into this, right? There's an annotation for ingress use waypoint. By default, the ingress doesn't go to the waypoint. So if users are opting in and they're choosing where they put their policies, it's completely in the hands of the users whether or not the bug happens. That's why I would push for the default to always be single L7 processing. However, if users have requirements to do double, or to match, or they want to match their expectation to doing double L7, then they're free to do so, right? So I don't have as quite of a concern with this.
Can you explain your perspective on the default there, Keith?
Sure. So by default, like John said, the ingress does not traverse the waypoint. So you only have a single layer, one round of layer 7 processing, which, to your point, avoids a whole class of double of bugs and things like that. If somebody wants to make ingress traffic traverse the waypoint, they do so understanding that they have to be very careful with how they write their policies. And in fact, if we want to, we can add like a very, very high level, like it's just ETL analyzer thing that just says we've got 2 levels of L7, double check, we can add documentation, but it's sort of an advanced mode, right? And I think that the way we have the default set today, we should keep them because it makes the common case easy where you have 1 level of L7, but if you need 2, you make that possible. Does that make sense to answer your question?
I think it does. I guess I think of it a little bit differently in that it sounds like right now the default is you can very easily write L7 policy that does not apply to your traffic. Be it namespace level traffic or service level traffic, those policies can fairly easily be bypassed by establishing an ingress. So I wonder if we should have a conversation about the default there and if that is the most intuitive default for our users.
That's a fair point.
John,
In the
you're the
comment-
author. Did you put, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jackie.
Oh, I just had a question about it in his comment. He says the latency will be doubled. Is that true? Did we test that?
I mean, it's a hard measurement to claim, but I would say in any case, there's a latency on there's many more pieces that are contributing latency than the waypoint and ingress hop, so it's unlikely to be truly double. Like,
Okay.
it would only be if the network latency is 0 and the application latency is 0, which are impossible.
Yeah, got it.
It's increased, certainly, but I wouldn't expect it to be double.
Okay.
Onto the default. This is not the primary motivation, but one motivation is that this is a somewhat controversial proposal. So making it default is even more controversial. The bigger motivation, though, is one, there's backwards compatibility with what we already have. Still maybe not the most pressing, given that we haven't gone GA yet. But if we were to have this conversation in 2 weeks, then it would be even bigger factor. But I also think the users just aren't necessarily used to this idea that these things are composing, and that like you end up with a chance of having double policy application, which is kind of not ideal, right? So the real risk is that when you actually do this, you need to change how you write your rules. Like, people today are writing rules so that they think that one proxy is enforcing them all at once, so they put all their logic there. You actually need to change your rules here so that your gateway tier is just doing the edge stuff, and then your waypoint tier is doing the internal stuff. And I just don't think that people have policies written like that, so that if they were to just adopt this without being cognizant of that, they'll end up with weird behavior. Like, in my mind, the user journey is that they have probably a route at one layer or the other, or some config, and then they decide they want to expose it on ingress or expose it with a waypoint, and they do kind of a two-step thing. Like, they realize that, they apply the annotation, and they change their policies, is how I envisioned it. I'm not 100% against it being default. I just thought it was safer to do it this way, certainly. It may be something that 2 years from now, though, we look back and we're like, oh, we were dumb. We should have defaulted it that way. Now we make users just do this extra step. So I could see the argument for default as well.
I mean, everything starts as non-default. I totally get that. I would see having this for a version or two as non-default, but then using maybe our compatibility versions to change the default, say in February or something like that.
Yeah, that's true. I forgot about we could do it with compatibility versions. So
Are there reasonable alternatives that we can imagine for how to ensure that policy can't be bypassed, or is this pretty much it?
I guess I don't see this as a problem that should be solved by technology. It feels like a human problem. And the approach that the PR does is it gives users time to adjust the way that they think about and write their policies. I feel like we can do our best to like highlight the number of layers of L7 that they're doing. But I feel like anything more than just giving the users the information is going to probably break things in non-obvious ways.
Go ahead, Louis.
Yeah, I think there are two ways to kind of think about attaching policy, right? One is logically, and the other way is infrastructurally. Everything we've ever done has been infrastructural attachment. Trying to move to a model which is more logical based, like, hey, we have something in the policy language that says, if this traffic is from ingress, then do this, else do that. While it may be more correct, and in bigger systems more durable in terms of the policy ability to adapt to the environmental changes, but that isn't really how anybody has ever implemented policy ever in infrastructure space. And so I think we're stuck with an infrastructural kind of mindset for policy attachment and policy interpretation.
So Louis, does that mean you would be opposed to this pull request or?
No, the opposite.
Okay,
Right. I mean, what this is saying is we're going to compose to infrastructural things, and the policies that are attached to those infrastructural things now compose via that infrastructural composition mechanism. Right. The other way to write policies is to try and put the logic of composition into the policy itself rather than into the attachment. As others have pointed out, right? Like there's lots of ways where you can end up with lots of tiers of L7, and people are dealing with those problems today.
yeah,
If you look at, examples where policy attachment or policy might cause problems because it's applied twice, the one most often cited is retry. Authorization policy is probably not a problem. Header decoding, if it's done twice, is usually not a problem either. It's just wasting cycles, but it's not. It's usually an idempotent operation. So, retry, timeout, exponential back off style things are those things that cause production issues usually. Misalignment of header interpretation can cause an issue, but it's more like an enterprise consistency thing rather than like they're like actively interfering with each other.
that makes sense.
Right, and that would be true, if you were using another L7 in addition to the Istio one.
Yeah.
Now, we should probably provide a recommendation about things like timeout and retry. If you've got a multi-tier ingress, right, regardless of whose tiers are implementing it, where do you want retry to be done? Where do you want timeout to be done? It's something you have to think about.
This feels like really good candidates for documentation and or KubeCon talks because, again, to your points, I don't know that users are thinking about this today. It's one of the fundamental shifts coming from sidecar land. So I think we have a lot of evangelism to do over in this area.
Right, and not all of it is like, some of these problems existed with sidecar too. Timeout certainly could have logically existed with sidecar.
So then I guess the next question, it sounds like we have consensus that we do need to close the hole on policy bypass here. How should we communicate this to Zhonggu? Would it be worthwhile setting up like a one-off meeting for a couple of us to talk to him about it?
Yeah, I think that would be the best.
Okay. I'll work with him to get something scheduled after this week, since I know you guys are busy.
Yeah, I guess there's a question. Do we want to block the PR?
Yeah. Given the code freeze time, if we wait until after this week, then we'll be too late.
I forgot about that. So why don't, since you guys are busy this week, I can try to meet with Zhonggu and walk him through this decision, and then I'll let you guys know, and we can. Should I ask him to remove the block, or do we just administratively remove the block? I'm not sure we've done this before.
I mean, in theory, like we have the ability to. I think a nicer approach would be to say that as TOC, we've acknowledged your concerns, but we still think we want to move forward with this, and then go from there, and we can meet to discuss more.
Yeah, maybe Mitch, start with a dedicated Slack thread with Zhonggu and the TOC.
Okay. Yep.
Just let him know what happened and say, what John just said.
That sounds good.
Yeah, and we'll be somewhat available to chat, just not, I don't
Sure,
think,
sure, not for real
get
time.
a meeting with Asian time zone or whatnot. So
Yeah. Okay, I'll take action on that.
okay,
Next.
awesome. Thanks for taking on some of this, Mitch.
Yeah.
This one I put on to resolve this one's also fairly timely because it's blocking a few different PRs. And the idea is what should be an annotation or a label. And so there is some disagreement amongst this, which is why this is a document. It's not because I like to make documents about random things. So I'll lay out what I think, and I'll lay out the opposition as well, which is primarily Ben's opinion. I would think maybe Keith agrees with it, or maybe he was, I don't know how strongly he feels, if he can argue the point. But basically, just from a technical standpoint, I want to give some background, is that annotations are kind of arbitrary key to value things. There's no schema validation on the annotation. There's maybe a size limit. I don't even think there is, actually. The size limit is just the etcd max. Labels, though, can only be 63 characters, and they are only alphanumeric and dots. So you can't have things like slashes, commas, JSON blobs. Basically, anything complex you really can't put in there. Labels are also the only thing you're able to do efficient queries against. It doesn't really matter for most of ECO cases because we always have all the objects in memory anyways, for like 99% of cases, but it is a difference. So that's the technical differences. If you scroll up just like a couple lines from like the Kubernetes docs, they kind of say labels are about kind of selecting objects and having collections of objects. So they have things like, oh, this is the app name, this is the team that owns it, this is, things like that. And then annotations are kind of vague. They just say it's kind of things. A lot of other projects use annotations for all their configuration, like Nginx and AWS LB, and define any labels for them. So what I was pushing for is that basically we should use a label if it's configuration, which is probably the majority of cases, and only use a label if it's really about grouping things.
John, I think you just said label twice. In the first case, did you mean annotation?
I did, yes.
Okay.
Yep, sorry, it's easy to mix up. Obviously, there's some exceptions in kind of case-by-case basis, like subzone, is that a grouping or a configuration? A lot of things are kind of fuzzy in regards to that, which we can always discuss. Like one is like revision. Is it grouping the things that are part of the revision, or is it configuring which revision to use? It's kind of both at once. The other proposal is about kind of the user intent, and that if it's user facing, it should be a label. If it's like machine driven, like a code is writing it, it should be an annotation. The idea here is that there's very clear separation of how users should do things. It's very obvious for a developer to know what they should put it in, because they know whether a user touches it or not. And yeah, I think that's the primary benefits there. And the idea would be that we would apply this to all future things. Like there's already a lot of things that don't. Oh, actually, there's a huge list of benefits way down here. So maybe I didn't appropriately list the benefits here. If you scroll down a bit.
This here?
Yeah, I guess Ben wrote this part, so I'm not as familiar. I'm reading it for the first time, actually. I didn't see this was added.
Oh, so this is his alternate proposal, right?
Yeah, my proposal is just the short, like 5 lines that are highlighted. And at the bottom, I have some analysis of the existing usage and categorized by both methods to kind of see what we were doing historically. So if you look down towards the bottom, you can see on labels, most of them are kind of identification or enablement of things. There's a few oddballs, like gateway port, I think is clearly misused, as is probably enable auto IP allocation. But if you look on annotations, they're all pretty much configuration or machine status. I also split them up as complex or simple. The complex ones are ones that cannot be labels due to validation, because they're not valid labels when what people put in them. So that's really like my primary concern with the label proposal. The alternate proposal is that it's not technically feasible. Like most of these configurations actually cannot be labels from a schema validation perspective, which is a huge blocker to the proposal of users are always doing labels. The other point of contention is that there's agreement between me and Ben that historically things looked like this, which is a pretty decently consistent separation of labels and annotations. But is whether we should take that into account or whether we should start from clean slate moving forward. My argument was that if we start being consistent with a new consistency standard moving forward, then we're not actually consistent, because then a user has to think, is this thing added after 2024? Okay, then I have to set a label. Was it added before? Okay, then it's maybe annotation. So it actually drives less consistency if we change our stance as a project. Even if maybe the new proposal is slightly better, I think favoring historical context is more consistent for users over the long term. If you scroll down a bit more, there's also a categorization of human versus machine, where you can see it's kind of hit or miss which one it is. But most things are human driven, so there's actually not that many machine options. So yeah, that's the general proposal. I can go into more details if I skimmed over anything too fast, but that's kind of the gist of things.
John, at a high level, both of you are proposing changing what we've done historically, or I'm not sure I follow the difference.
No, I mean, historically, we didn't have a policy, so it was just whatever the API reviewers at the time were saying. Any review that I reviewed, I would have implicitly followed the proposal that I'm saying. And I think likely that others were doing it because, like, if you look, it's pretty consistent of what we've done in the past based on that categorization. And I think that's how Kubernetes recommends you do it. So, like, I think we've had an implicit policy that's been moderately enforced.
So your proposal just formalizes that?
Yeah, I could, if someone said that's BS, the implicit policy was actually this thing, I wouldn't be surprised because it's implicit. But that's my intent, yeah.
And is Ben's proposal that we rewrite these labels and annotations and change them, or also a moving forward perspective?
Yeah, just moving forward.
I see.
I do want to add one thing on the consistency argument. I think that with ambient, we're in a little bit of a better position. So I take your point, John, that a new policy as of today isn't necessarily more consistent. But I do think if we're taking the bet that most issue users in 15 years are going to be ambient users, then we could potentially make their lives easier by switching to a different policy. So just throwing that out there.
Yeah, potentially. I will say that with ambient, we did screw ourselves over by putting use waypoint as a label and only later realizing that we needed to put a slash in there. And then we had to make it two labels, use waypoint and use waypoint namespace. If we had used an annotation there, it would not have happened. Now, I do classify these as kind of this identification enablement. It's a very fuzzy area. Like, it's somewhat grouping, but it's also somewhat configuring, right? But just a call out there on ambient of some of the few annotations we've added, or label slash annotation. We have had issues here.
Yeah, as much as these decisions sometimes come back to bite us, I do think trying to maintain consistency with our historical values is going to make the most sense. I haven't had enough time to really look at the two policies comparatively, but if we came up with a new policy that was much better and just demonstrably better for how to allocate these things, but we still had no path to change them historically, I feel like unless it was many orders of magnitude better, it would just result in more confusion for our users.
I think I tend to agree with Mitch thinking it over. I think I personally like the idea of label equals user intent annotation as kind of sort of machine-driven status. But I take the points that are made here, and I also think that those are things for me. I like them as a reviewer, as a maintainer. I think users just are going to set whatever is set, whatever the doc state is set. I don't think they particularly care too much as long as it works. That being said, I think we have to make sure we do a good job, continue to do a good job of documentation here and not confuse labels versus annotations. So I think I'm in favor of kind of maintaining existing consistency.
Any opinions that you can offer in the car, Louis, or we can always follow up. We can probably get Lynn's opinion as well. So,
I mean, generally, I would lean towards consistency. I mean, obviously, the limitations of labels are problematic from an API definitional standpoint, but the hardest thing we ever do to users is churn APIs, and for better or for worse, labels / annotations have become an integral part of our API service. So
when you say consistency, does that mean with the previous decisions?
with the historical usage in the project.
Got it. Okay, we're pretty much out of time. I'll probably just run this by Lynn as well, since she wasn't able to make it. But it sounds like we're mostly all leaning in the same direction. Any other comments on this? I'm also happy to stick around for the last topic. If I don't know, I assume this is Keith and Mitch, or both of you, or some combination. So if you guys have time and you want to chat about it.
So a lot changed last week with the understanding of traffic distribution and discovering of some of the locality concepts that are already integrated into zTunnel. But I don't know that those are necessarily urgent this week. Like, there's no aim to get anything done before the code freeze or anything like that. Maybe if we can try for the ambient meeting next a week and a half from now. And if we don't get enough traction, then we might want to schedule like a one-off session, particularly to deep dive into multi-cluster. But I don't think we need to do that this week.
Okay. I did say I was going to go re-review it, and I haven't done that yet. And I don't know if I will today at least. So, but if there's specific questions, just ask on that Slack channel, and I'll probably see it. So
awesome.
That's
Thank you.
okay. I made some changes recently, so it's probably good that you didn't go ahead and review it. Basically, the changes were to update the service host name stuff after we made that decision. And I think my open question, for what it's worth, for folks to ponder around traffic distribution, is just sort of, are we going to be able to enable users to send traffic, to have traffic go outside their cluster if there are endpoints in their local cluster? And I don't think traffic distribution allows that today.
yeah, so if you set traffic distribution, Istio will keep it only within the same. Actually, it technically doesn't take cluster into account. It takes only
Right, it's region, zone, and subzone, right?
And network. So
And network, right.
The idea was about cost, really, in that
Yes.
if you have two clusters in the same zone in the same network, the cost to send traffic between them is the same as it is within the cluster.
Right. But so if you've got two, so the main use case I'm thinking of is like a multi-region deployment for Kubernetes. If you have distribution, and if we're keeping cluster local, how does traffic ever get to that remote cluster in the other region? And I don't see how that ever happens with traffic distribution.
Yeah, well, you have a big traffic distribution keeps things more local. So if you've already decided that cluster local is local, then traffic distribution can only make it even more local and only use a subset of your cluster. It can't expand it.
Right. Okay, that matches my understanding. Sorry, I was just making sure what we're discussing as making sure that we're on the same page with what traffic distribution does. But the WDS is actually more flexible, but traffic distribution as an API doesn't actually allow you to leverage those that ranking.
Yes, that is correct.
Gotcha. Okay. Like I said, the doc is there. If folks get time to review, that's fine. If not, we can figure it out next week at the ambient meeting.
Cool.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
See you.